that had gone on for 200 and almost 300 years.
Right.
In the Confederacy, we were here for 6 years. And in that 6-year frame of time, I'm talking about from the time that they had their first preliminary meetings, where they had begun to say, we're going to pull away from the United States, which was a legal act, by the way.
Yeah, the secession.
The succession was a legal act. But they begin to, one of the first things, if you compare our Constitution of the Confederacy to the United States Constitution, there are two differences. One is that the presidential term is a 6-year term, and he cannot run for re-election. Boy, that really changed things today, wouldn't it? But number two was the fact that the importation of slaves had to stop. It was illegal at the beginning of the establishment of the Confederate States to have slaves, to import new slaves.
Right.
Now, we had slaves here. That's a different issue. But we stopped importation. When did America outlaw importation of slaves? It was done after the war. You look at the timing of it, we stopped before they did. It was in our Constitution. You could not import slaves, where they continued on. I think that's something we ought to know. When the 6 states or 7 states pulled out, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, South Carolina, Louisiana, Texas, when they pulled out, Mississippi, when they pulled out and formed the Confederate States, America was still the largest slave owner in the country, in the world.
Right, because individuals like Delaware and
New Jersey.
Vermont, they
Yeah.
still had
Yes.
slaves as
Right.
well. So, you know,
Corwin Amendment, Jack.
right. Say that again.
When those Gulf states, that they call them the Cotton States, left the Union, that was March of 1861, all that had happened by that time. The United States Congress, minus those 7 states, passed, ratified through the House of Representatives and the Senate, the Corwin Amendment. It was signed by Lincoln, even though he didn't have to acknowledge it. It was signed by James Buchanan, even though he didn't have to acknowledge it. It was sent to the states. 5 states ratified the Corwin Amendment before the war even got into its real, bloody stages. The Corwin Amendment was going to forever protect slavery from federal interference in the remainder of the United States. So that's what the Union thought of getting rid of slavery at the beginning of the war. No one teaches about the Corwin Amendment. It can't be found in a history book.
Yes.
If you're not the only person, I talk to people all the time.
Let us introduce for the people so they will know. If you'll tell us, Mr. Cowart, the name of the person speaking.
Okay, this is Colonel William Platt. He's a friend of mine. He's the commander of the camp in Panama City. Very knowledgeable of the history. And his camp is have black men in their camp.
Right.
Members.
Tell us about Mr. West, the individual you were telling me about, and we were down before.
You're talking about the gentleman that went to war with the guys?
Right.
In Calhoun County, Georgia, when the unit was being formed there, the man Washington Lee went to in fact, he rode his horse from Edison down to Morgan, where the unit was being formed, and wanted to join. And they said, no, we don't want blacks in our unit. They ran him off. They told him he's not welcome. And so he went back up to Edison. He got his oxen. He had 2 oxen. And he was known to be a good cook. And he had a wagon. And he went around and started asking for salt and sugar and necessities that they would have. And people would donate food. And he followed that unit all the way, ultimately, all the way to Gettysburg. And when they set camp, he was always there. He was cooking food for them. His name was Washington Lee. I know where he's buried at. We'd like to put a monument up for him there in Calhoun County someplace. But Washington Lee traveled and followed those men for 4 years and fed them. When they went out fighting, he'd go out hunting, asking. He says hunting, fishing, or asking. And he'd go up, knock on doors, and say, hey, we got our unit, we're trying to feed. As far as he was concerned, he was a part of that Confederate unit. Now, he's a black man. He was a free black man during the war. But he wanted to support the South and what they were doing. And he fought all the way up and then back into Georgia, then back over to Appomattox. And at the closing days, they saw General Lee ride in, and someone had to tell him who he was. He said, well, you're named after him. You know, you got his name, Washington Lee. And so General Lee rode in and surrendered to Grant. We know the history there at Appomattox. And all the unit, what was left of them, there's only about 20% of them left, got on his wagon and he brought them all the way home. And so in my mind, Washington Lee is a hero. Race and color has nothing to do with the battles in the war. There were over 80,000 black Confederate soldiers. You think about that. Now the Union had
Brother
black
Jack,
as well.
Harvard will only admit to 6,000.
Okay, yeah, they only admitted we had 6,000. We had over 80,000. I've got a book that has a list of all the blacks who have received monuments, headstones on their graves, and it says on there, colored, because they were black soldiers that were freed, or they were slaves that went to war, that were killed, and they have that honor of having that on a Confederate headstone.
And this was not a forced action
No,
by their
no.
slave owner? This
Well,
was something they
I
felt
don't doubt.
passionate about?
I don't doubt. But listen, a lot of the families in that day, they had slaves, and you know, like Mr. Fudge there in Miller County, he said, mount up, Sam, we gotta go. And Sam got up in the unit and he got ready and he went with them. And so yes, he was a slave, but he was going with his master. And when his master got killed, Sam picked his body up, he was wounded, carried him to an aid station. When he died, he lowered him up, was going to carry him all the way, and he was carrying him. Physically, that's a heavy thing, you know, carry a dead body. And he carried him so far, he said, I can't do this. And so he found a place in Virginia, he buried him under a tree, thinking he'd come back and get him. But he went all the way home. Now you think about this, here's a slave, couldn't read and write, walking all the way from Virginia to South Georgia. And that man made it all the way home, went up the steps of his house to the lady, he called her Missy. He said, Missy, he died. He was killed. The family didn't even know the man was killed. Didn't know he was dead. It took several weeks for that man to walk all the way home and said, Missy, he's dead. And she said, get the buckboard, get so-and-so, you know, go back up there and get his body. And they rode all the way back up and couldn't find where they buried him. He lost the direction. That man came all the way home. Now he's free. At that point, he could do anything he wanted to.
Right.
He could have gone on the end of the line and joined the Union and got an $80 a month paycheck and been a soldier for the Union. But he came all the way home and spent the rest of his life on that farm taking care of his master's wife and children, making sure that they had what they needed. And so he was a noble person. But you know, you start thinking about some of the blacks who did serve. Mr. Collier over in Mississippi. You ever heard of him? Yeah. Mr. Collier was a black man that when Franklin Roosevelt, after the war, Franklin Roosevelt wanted to go kill a bear. He was known for his hunting. His men contacted Mr. Collier down in Mississippi. He said, yeah, bring the president down here, we'll help him out. And Mr. Collier went into the woods and took a stick, he caught a bear, tied him to a tree, and then went back out and got the president. The president come in and shoot his bear. The president gets in there, of course the media is watching. And he said, I can't kill him, he's tied to a tree. I can't do that. And that's not what I want. Well, see, Mattel Toy Company had toy bears that they couldn't sell. Guess what they called them?
Teddy bears.
Teddy bears. Teddy Roosevelt. That's where they got
That's
the
where
name
they
from.
came
Yes.
From that instance.
And it changed the Mattel Toy Company became a leading company of making teddy bears.
Right.
And today that's a protected name. You can't call any of them teddy bears, but you call theirs. Teddy bears comes from Teddy Roosevelt.
But I didn't know the
that's
backstory.
history.
I knew.
That's history. What about Coca-Cola? You like Coca-Cola?
Of course.
We like Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
Guess who invented Coca-Cola? It was this Confederate soldier that had been wounded. He was a pharmacist, went back to Columbus, Georgia, and he began to work with certain ideas of trying to come up with a drink that would help kill the pain that he was in.
Right.
And from that, of course, they did use cocaine at one time, but after a while, they got rid of the cocaine and other things, but they came out with Coca-Cola, and that's an invention from the Confederacy. So, you think about all the inventions, man, during that war, there were a lot of things. A gentleman came up with the idea of landmines, and he told General Longstreet, I can protect your front with landmines. I'll plant things out there that if a soldier come up and step on it, it'd blow them up.
Right.
And so they allowed him to do it. He put out a couple hundred of them. The Union soldiers walked up there, were being blown up, and General Longstreet took a white flag and said, this is not the right way of fighting the war. It's not humane.
Right.
And so he outlawed landmines. Guess what? That man went over to Lincoln, offered it, Lincoln accepted it. And so they were established there. Arlington National Cemetery, and we ever talked, you think about that, that's a beautiful, beautiful place today, sacred for Americans, as it should be. But you know where it came from? Arlington home there, the plantation, was Robert E. Lee's home.
Mm-hmm.
And so across the street from our nation's capital, they looked over and said, hey, that's Robert E. Lee's house. I'm going to bury people right there at his doorstep. He'll never live there again. And they started burying Union soldiers there. And that's where Arlington National Cemetery came. Now, after the war, they were sued. The United States was sued over that by the Lee family. And the government had to pay the Lee family for their property. They got it for pennies on the dollar. But you could look around in the things in our country that the South is responsible for. And if you read books, the book Colonel recommended I read Up From Slavery by
Booker T. Washington.
Booker T. Washington. If you ever get a chance to read that book, I listened to it. I was driving trucks at the time, and I listened to that book 10 times, I guess, on my radio, on my audible book form there. But I loved it, and I learned a lot. But Booker T. Washington said the greatest asset to the blacks after the war were white men, Southern men that helped raise us up. They are the ones that we owe our success to. So I think it's something.
Can I point one thing out, Jack?
Yeah.
In 1867, the Republican Party was formed in Alabama. Since we're in Alabama, the election that was held that year, the Republicans swept it because white people were not allowed to vote.
Right.
White Southern males, the only white people that could vote in Alabama at that time, because women couldn't vote, were not allowed to run for or hold political office or to vote.
Yeah.
So the Republicans swept every single seat in Alabama. That was 1867. 13 years later, there's an 1880 election, and now Reconstruction has ended. Every single seat was a former Confederate. Every single seat, it went from one extreme to the other. Now, Tuskegee Institute was funded by one, but not both, of those political bodies.
You know who did it?
When was Tuskegee funded?
After the war.
1881, by an entirely
Different.
former Confederate state legislature, including the governor who signed the money,
And what prompted that to happen in 18?
because the people that took over in 1867 weren't from Alabama. They didn't care about people in Alabama.
Carpetbaggers or scallywags.
But the people that fought the war in Alabama realized there was no way that Alabama could have fought the United States without the support of its black slave population.
That's right.
One single slave rebellion would have ended the war between the states. One single rebellion in Dothan, Alabama, all the white men, because 90% of the fighting was done in Virginia and Tennessee. None of these white men from South Alabama fought in South Alabama. They all went to Virginia and Tennessee. And that's where they fought and died. And their families were left in the care, if they were wealthy enough to own slaves, in the hands of their slaves. And that's what Booker T. Washington says in his book.
And I remember you telling me about that. Thank you. I remember you telling me about that back in November. That it was the wealthy that was pretty much turning everything as far
Right,
as
that's
the
always-
war, the Civil War.
That's always true.
Give some.
That's even
story
today.
about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that goes on even now. But you know, in 1619, the first slaves came to America.
Right.
That's not true, Brother Jack. I have to interrupt you.
That period of time,
1655, the first black slave was declared. He was owned by Anthony Johnson, who was a free black
who
British
was a black man
subject.
himself, yeah.
And he sued another black man and became the first person in the British colonies to own a slave. Anthony Johnson, free black British subject, sued John Kaser and was awarded John Kaser for life. That was the first instance of slavery in the British North American
In the
colonies.
British colonies.
And you can find that at the NAACP website.
What I'm trying to point out is from then until 1776, the English colonies allowed slavery. And then in 1776, when America became a nation, they continued slavery until 1860. In 1860, when the Confederacy was formed, slavery, the importation of slaves was outlawed. The United States continued slavery at that point.
Continue to practice, right?
They continued it, the practice of it. So for 5 years, the Confederacy had slaves. All the way from early 1800s, 1600s until then. You know, it continued. Why are we upset about this at that 4 or 5 year period? You got all this other time. And by the way, let me ask you this. According to the FBI, there's slavery in Atlanta, Georgia today. Human trafficking takes place today. As a matter of fact, I had an FBI agent to tell me there are more slaves held in Atlanta today than there was in 1860.
And what Mr. Cowart is referring to, like he said, human trafficking, those are individuals being brought in from throughout the world to the Atlanta airport. And Dothan itself is a highway
Right.
regarding human trafficking, because you're either going to taking those individuals down to Florida
Well, they're being held. They're in
or
Atlanta.
in Atlanta itself in certain areas regarding slave factories,
These
sexual,
children coming across
right.
our open border that we have right now are being carried to Atlanta, to Chicago, to Philadelphia, all over, and being distributed, and they're being sold into slavery today. Now, my question is this: why are we outraged over what happened 150 years ago, and we're not upset as much about it today?
There are strategies being utilized today, such as the Blue Campaign, and that is being that was founded by the Homeland Security. So it is about creating awareness that this is even happening, because there are people that completely got their head in the sand, or they just do not know that human trafficking is a form of slavery, and it is happening in the 21st century. That's part of our cause as an organization. But as far as the flag itself, the Confederate flag, with my ancestors, there's a feeling of resentment, or let's just say it, fear, because of some of the instances, hate group, things of that nature that tend to plague people of color.
But you shouldn't down me for honoring my ancestors.
Right.
And of course, to us, the flag is St. Andrew's cross. Is not a slavery symbol. It's a symbol of Christianity. So their attack is on Christianity. It's not on the South. I mean, this represents.
We're just the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, we're just the easy picking fruit that they're getting. But the flag itself represents St. Andrew, who said, I don't want to die like Jesus did. I want to be different. So they put him on an X cross instead of the type cross that Jesus was buried on or crucified on. And so, as a pastor, this is a Christian symbol to me. It is not hatred. It's not anger. You know, I remember when integration took place, all that back in the 60s and 70s, our school was integrated, and we were traditionally a white school, and we became an integrated school in Atlanta, and where I grew up. And our band could no longer play the battle song. We had to give up Dixie and all this. But if you sing Dixie, if you look at the words, there's nothing in it about slavery. There's nothing in it about oppression to the black people.
But I think it's the reference of the word Dixie, the connotations that are involved with that brings about it. I knew you were going to say something. Let me finish. He's ready. It's the negative connotations that are involved with the word Dixie, as in reference to some of those harsh memories and some of those harsh recalls of being in a place where you're not considered equal, where you're not considered even human. You were considered property because you were purchased, and you were shipped over as cargo. The dehumanization of an individual simply because of the color of their skin or where they were brought in from, such as West Africa. All of that kind of meshes together in a bad way because if you hear Dixie or if you hear the song Dixie, and like you said, absolutely no reference whatsoever regarding slavery, but it's just those connotations, and I know you burning up. Let me give it a roll. Excuse me, Mr. Cowart. He was waiting patiently.
Okay.
Let me turn it over to you, Turtle. Go ahead.
I just want to thank everybody for being here and realize that you are participating in something that is unique. That probably has not happened for 150 years since the last time that we all got together as family, right before the war. Right?
Yeah.
Right before the war.
Yeah.
Thousands of black people owned slaves in the South, the Confederate States. The 5 civilized tribes, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, they owned slaves, right? I mean, so are we're gonna bash those 5 civilized tribes and the free blacks that own slaves? If we need to do that, we're gonna bash the white people that own slaves. But here's the deal. This is all I have to say about it, is that no white man ever built a boat and went to Africa and picked up slaves on his own. It didn't happen.
And that's what
there were African kings that wanted stuff like tobacco and red cloth and rum and whatever they wanted. And he said, hey, we got this. What do you have to offer us? And he said, I got these people I captured in a war. I'll give them to you. And they're like, well, we're not really into that, because they weren't. And they said, well, watch. I can kill this person. That's the total control that I have over them. I will transfer to you this legal status of this person. And we were like, because like Jack said, 1619, the blacks that came to the free world, to the New World, they were indentured servants. They were not slaves. Absolutely were not slaves. The 1619 is a lie. That was done because a woman wanted to make some money off of a movement that she had no idea what was going on. 1655, according to NAACP, is the first time there was a black man who was a slave in the British colonies. John Kaser should be on everybody's lips, and the fact that I'm the only person in this room that knows his name is a problem. Because if you knew his name, and she knew his name, and he knew his name, and all these people knew his name, we would know when slavery started in the New World, in the British colonies. And I keep saying the British colonies because it was different for the Spaniards, it was different for the French, it was different for the Dutch, it was different for the Portuguese. That's a whole bunch of history that we can't even talk about.
No, we will not have time.
We don't have time.
Today, but I think we gotta dive into that. What he's referring to, everyone, is the fact that Florida was not American back at that time. It was occupied by the Spanish, and portions of Louisiana was occupied by, of course, the French. And so until the United States actually became the United States, different territories were owned or by the various countries, and various countries had various rules. Right, colonies, thank you. They had different rules, and different things that were allowed in their area may not be allowed up in, let's say, Delaware, things of that nature.
Well, what we were addressing was the ships that were doing the transportation. They were not Confederate ships.
No.
The Confederate flag never flew on the slave ship.
No.
Never.
No.
So I think, like, just to interject, like, so people who are watching can sort of understand the flag, because I'm putting the pieces together, should not be blamed for the actions of men. It's not necessarily the flag, because the actions existed before the flag ever existed. These were the actions of just people in general. So it shouldn't be blamed.
Young person in your youth, okay? I look at you as a young person. In your youthfulness, this became a hatred symbol because of Hollywood. It was not because of actions, because the KKK did not use this flag.
Not necessarily. My first interactions with that actually happened in school.
Okay.
I wasn't allowed to watch a lot of TV growing up.
Okay.
So but my exposure to that wasn't really that. My first interactions, because I went to Ashford, in school, I went to Ashford Elementary School.
Okay.
And so my first interactions was actually seeing my classmates wear it on their T-shirts.
Okay.
And then like with my interactions with them, although we were all friends and everything, like, you know, you see teachers talking about it, and you see, you know, okay, you're not allowed to wear that anymore. Well, okay, what does that mean? Well, that's a symbol of like Confederate hatred, and they don't like black people or teachers.
What I'm saying is that it was a modern influence. It was not 1860s that they were taught that. It's been in the recent days. And I mean, when I say recent, I mean the last 30, 40 years, where Hollywood and the media and the liberals begin to say, oh, that's a symbol of racism. That's when young people like you begin to say, oh, it is? Okay, then I'm going to dislike it, and I'm going to repel against it because it's a symbol of hate, because of what they're saying in a modern setting. It was not so in the South. Your ancestors 100 years ago didn't see this as a threat. It was not a symbol of hatred back then.
No, I wouldn't say that the flag was. I think the actions of those who championed it, some of those who championed it, was. Like seeing you can't drink from here, you can't go in here, you can't be here. So being, like we explained earlier, being dehumanized by those who champion that. And we are aware, we visited plantations that were ran by African Americans. And that's been amazing to be a part of our team. And we understand that there are groups, we know about the 5 tribes, that white Americans were not the only people to own slaves, nor were they the first to own slaves. However, they did participate a lot in it and heavily in it, and were heavy-handed in it. It's not necessarily a Southern thing, which is what I think we're trying to allude to with this conversation, that if we're going to place blame, then blame should be placed equally. The same way if we're going to place the status of hero, like that should be shared equally as well. And so listening to this conversation, because sir, you brought up a good point, there were African kings that were willing to trade over their people, but that was not always the case. Sometimes it was the fact that, okay, we needed people to perform this task. We don't want to do it, and we know where we can go and get it. And even though at first it was innocent enough to where, hey, we didn't really want to do it, after about a couple of years, okay, yeah, we doing it. We doing it, and we doing it, and we doing it some more. Yeah, but we're not the only ones doing it, which is
when
important.
did a civilization not have slavery?
That's
The Romans, the
exactly.
Greeks, I mean, you go all the way, the Chinese.
But in the 1600s, that was the first time that slavery based solely on what a person looked like became mainstream. Before, you are absolutely right. For thousands of years, slavery based off of you owing people, okay, I'm taking you and you're gonna go work, like you can't pay me, okay, you're coming to the, slavery is not new, but slavery based off of, okay, you look like you sound like you, and you know what, let's just come on over here, based off of that division based off of appearance is starting to be introduced there.
I would challenge you to think about this. Who controls the narrative and who puts the story out there? Because what you just said is nothing more than another chapter in the narrative that you're supposed to believe. I can tell you that people have always looked at people that were different from them and said, I don't care, you're now my slave, you lost the war. They're easier to identify if they look different, correct?
Yeah, but when we're talking about mass removal of a group of people from one location to another outside of war.
Let me ask you a question. What word are we using more than any other word in this discussion? What word have we used more than any other word since we started?
Confederate.
Slave.
Slavery.
Slave.
Slave.
Where does the word slave come from? All words have history. They all have origins. Where did the word slave come from? This is very important. If you don't get this right, you will fail the test. It comes from the word Slav, because Slavs, people on the Mediterranean, European side, were the people that everyone realized was being brutalized in this trade of stealing people and bringing them to Africa. Slave is a derivation of the word Slav. And Arab raiders were raiding into Europe and bringing Slavs back to Africa. And that's where the word comes from. And Slavs do not look like Arabs, nor do they look like people who are Negroid. They look different. So this has been going on for a long time. We're hopefully blessed that it never happens again. But as Brother Jack has told you, they're just changing the words.
Yeah.
Why don't we enforce our border? We could. We could keep people from coming across.
Don't you do that. Stop.
We
We only got a few minutes.
We like cheap labor.
Don't.
Do we like cheap
Well,
labor?
we gotta do that another day.
Yes, ma'am.
But
There is a place for that.
yeah, I know it was, no, don't you do it. We're gonna wrap up now.
Do we have any
To our
questions?
time. Did you have any questions?
No, I think everyone's just intently listening. So no, there's no
We want to
question.
thank everybody for intently listening. Please share this conversation, no matter, yeah, and we just want to thank Mr. Jack Cowart so very much for doing this.
What I want to come out of this with is, I don't hate someone because of color of skin. I don't hate someone because of their hair. I don't hate someone because of their upbringing. I want to honor my ancestors. I want my ship that I built, that submarine, it is a monument. I don't think we'll tear everybody else's monuments down because we're not liking that monument. It's like the Indian that went across out there at Wounded Knee, and he said, I have this monument of Custer. And they said, won't we tear it down? He said, oh no, that's our history. We need to teach history. And our schools are not teaching history. It's like the gentleman said over there, the head of school in Doherty County years ago. He said, our job is not to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. Our job is to help acclimate children in society. That's not true. our school systems need to be teaching history. The reason there's so much rebellion against, we don't understand each other's culture. And we need to reach out to each other and touch each other's heart. Not go beyond the skin. My daughter's here. We've had black children in our house over and over. As a pastor, I had more blacks in my church than I had whites sometimes. So race is not a problem until we start looking at color of skin and that kind of thing. We need to get beyond that, and we need to look at people's hearts.
And understand that there is a differentiation between hate and, like you said, heritage, and not wanting your heritage erased. And I believe we feel the same way with regards to Juneteenth. We don't want it to we don't want individuals stating, oh, that's not even real. Oh, that's not a real holiday, or why should we recognize that? No, it is real, it did happen. And both of us passionate about history. Let us preserve each part of that history rather than trying to erase one over the other. And I see Elizabeth nodding her head.
Right.
Mr. Cowart, again.
She's heard that from me.
Mr. Cowart, again, we're going to wrap this up.
Thank you so much for allowing us for being here. Thank you.
I know it was an ordained moment when you and I met. Mr. Cowart, he was just sitting out waiting for someone to...
Waiting for you.
Yeah, and the moment I saw the hunt, I was like, whoa, I gotta go check this out.
Yeah.
And my husband was like, leave that man alone.
There are no coincidences.
Yeah, and I was like, come on, babe, I gotta go check it out. And when I got closer to you and I saw your ring was a Confederate ring, I was like, whoops.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, we're gonna go for it. We're here now, let's just go on for it. And ladies and gentlemen, if you need to reach out to Mr. Jack Cowart, we will provide his information on the site. He is free and open to come and speak at any assembly. And we thank you so very much for being present. And did you have anything else you wanted to close with?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share. And let's keep heritage, teach history. Let's teach our young people the history. And I encourage young people to get involved in finding out your heritage. Find out who your family were and what they did. You live in Cowart, Alabama, I think. And my family, Cowart, the founders of Cowart, Alabama, was my family. And I'm proud of that. And they came over just getting timber out of here and established the city of Cowart, Alabama. So we're proud of our heritage. Look back, find out. Don't forget where you come from. Always remember that.
Thank you so very much, and we appreciate everybody for chiming in today. Thank you all for being here today. We thank you and have a great day.